I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we bring you updates from Ukraine's counter-offensive, and our assistant comment editor Francis Durnley interviews defence editor Con Coughlin on his new book, Assad, the Triumph of Tyranny.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
We need a military strategy for Ukraine to gain a decisive advantage on the battlefield, to win the war.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Friday, the 23rd of June, 1 year and 119 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by our associate editor Dominic Nichols, foreign reporter Maina Nanu, assistant comment editor Francis Durnley, and defence editor Con Coughlin. I started by asking Dom for the latest news from Ukraine.
So, Hanna Maliar, Ukraine's Deputy Defence Minister, she's been talking about the counter-offensive. She says gains made and a partial success in the Crimea area. So we're now 50 k's north of Bakhmut. There has been continued offensive action across the whole front, although, as President Zelensky said the other day, that there's been mixed results, and they would hope to go further. But, you know, as we've often said, this is very, very early days in the counter-offensive. But Crimea, an area we've not looked at for a little while, up there north of Bakhmut, east of Kharkiv, that's it's still very violent up there as well. Staying in that area, the Ukrainian General Staff said that there were fierce battles and a Russian offensive halted in the area of the cities of Kupiansk and Liman, up there. So northeast, the northeast area of the country, east of Kharkiv, northwest-ish, 30-40 miles of Crimea. So still very, very active up there as well. There's also been fighting continuing on the line around the south and the southeast. So in Zaporizhia, the west of Zaporizhia, up to the river, the bend in the river, and also south in the area around Vuhledar, the area that's sort of heading, if they continue that advance, that's sort of going down towards Mariupol, that area. So continued activity across the line. Ms. Maliar, who, as I said, is the Deputy Defence Minister, she was on Ukrainian TV saying the main events are ahead of us. The main blow is yet to come. It's still to come, and then she finished saying, indeed, some of the reserves will be activated later. I mean, that's correct. We think, you don't use your reserves willy-nilly. Use them to plug gaps if the enemy make a sudden advance, catches you unawares, or to reinforce the success, to push an area that's showing particular promise. I think what she's also hinting at there is that we just haven't seen these we think 9 brigades. We think there's 12 new brigades. We think 9 of them have been equipped with the Western equipment, tanks and infantry fighting vehicles predominantly. They've yet to really show up. We've seen a few Leopards. Obviously, a few of them have been knocked out already, and some of the Bradleys. But actually, we've seen very, very little of the Western kit that's pushed in there. We think they're holding them back until they've identified where they really want to push through. So yes, I agree with Ms. Maliar there. I think the main event is ahead of us, and reserves / all the other brigades not yet activated. Elsewhere, last night there were more airstrikes across the country. Ukrainian Air Force reported 13 Kh-101 and 555 cruise missiles. Looks like they were predominantly fired at an airfield, in the Khmelnytsky region. This is around the middle of the country, so about 200 k's southwest of Kyiv. If you draw a line from Kyiv to Lviv, but draw a really sort of saggy line, and it bends a bit, like a smiley face at the bottom of that curve. That's where this airfield is. Ukrainian Air Force are saying all of those missiles were destroyed. However, there were other airstrikes across the country, including in Kherson City, and the strike there on a bus station, obviously a prime military target. A bus station there has killed civilians, but 2 at the moment, and the numbers, that's the last numbers I saw there. That's the updates as they are.
Thank you very much, Dom. Maidana, thank you so much for joining us from the Telegraph's Ukraine live blog. There's quite a lot going on the live blog today that you've been covering. Can we start with Yevgeny Prigozhin, who's come out and said quite a lot of interesting things?
Yes, so he, in a video today on Telegram, he's claimed that Russian forces are retreating in Ukraine's east and south amid high casualties. So he said that troops were retreating in the Kherson area and Zaporizhia. And he said, our soldiers are dying and they're leaving with wounds. And he also claimed that the Ukraine war was unnecessary. And he's accused the Russian Defense Ministry of deception. And he asks, what was the war needed for? War was needed for a bunch of scumbags to triumph and show how strong of an army they are. Now, this is some of the strongest language which he's used to date and is kind of an escalation in the growing tensions between him and the defence minister.
Can we move to some of the diplomatic updates? There's been a story out of Australia, some tensions between the Australian government and Russia. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so I actually spoke about this last week. So Russia had wanted to build a second embassy about 400 yards from the Australian Parliament in Canberra. And Australia essentially vetoed that plan on security grounds. And now we've learnt that there's a suspected Russian diplomat who's apparently squatting on the site of the proposed new embassy. So this is a middle-aged man, and we've seen pictures of him in track pants and a puffer jacket, and he's apparently squatting there. Anthony Albanese, who's the Australian Prime Minister, described him as some bloke standing in the cold on a blade of grass in Canberra, and he's insisted that he's not a threat to our national security. And I think Russia have said they're going to challenge the veto of this embassy in Australia's High Court. And Claire O'Neill, who's the Australian Home Affairs Minister, has said she doesn't think that Australia's national security is in danger or at threat of being compromised by a bloke sitting on a site. And she said, that Russia's challenge to the validity of the law isn't unexpected, and it's part of the Russian playbook.
Thanks, Maidana. Just one more thing, I think, to talk about. Obviously, earlier this week, Volodymyr Zelensky, Ukrainian president, alleged that Russia has prepared a radiation leak at the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. That's obviously been a huge story in Ukraine. I mean, lots of people I was talking to when I was there were speaking about this. They've now urged people not to panic or stockpile. Can you talk about this?
Yes. So obviously yesterday we saw that story. And now Kyiv is telling Ukrainians not to panic and not to stockpile iodine tablets. And the Kremlin have obviously said that this is a lie, but the president's warning has put lots of Ukrainians on alert, understandably. And, the demand for iodine at lots of pharmacies has been skyrocketing. So Zelensky has, said, please don't play the enemy's game. Russia is a terrorist country from which, like a monkey with a grenade, you can expect anything, the Ukrainian Health Ministry said. And it's warned against the adverse implications of wrongly taking iodine, and it said it could be fatal. So, yeah, that's just a warning.
Thank you very much, Maidana. Dom, can I come back to you? We talked a little bit there about the allegation on the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. You've been looking at some of the American reaction to this, and in particular the reaction of certain senators. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, this was an interesting thing that came out yesterday. So Senators Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal, who are on opposite sides of the House, so Lindsey Graham's Republican, Richard Blumenthal is a Democrat, they have introduced a draft resolution to the US Senate saying that if Russia or Belarus or any proxy forces linked to either of those either explode a nuclear weapon in Ukraine or destroy the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant such that NATO allies are threatened with radiation, that should be considered an attack on NATO. Now, at a press conference yesterday, Senator Graham said that moving tactical nuclear weapons out of Russia to Belarus, as we saw last week, he said that was unnerving and very provocative. And I'm going to read a few quotes. Well, it goes on a bit, but I'll read them directly because it is obviously a very serious situation, and I think it's worth our time just so that we're all clear on where the discussion is. So, Senator Graham said, the threat of the use of a nuclear device by Russia is real. He's echoing President Biden. He said that last week. And the best way to deter it is to give clarity to the Russians as to what happens if they do that. They will be in a war with NATO. Our message is to those around Putin that if you do this, if you follow his order, you can expect a massive response from NATO and you will be at war with NATO. If you go down the road of exploding a nuclear weapon in Ukraine to try to turn the tide of battle, that would be an attack on NATO. If you blow up a nuclear power plant to create chaos, that could be considered an attack on NATO. If you want to deter war, you have to send clear signals on the cost of action. So that was Senator Lindsey Graham. And then Richard Blumenthal, he was referencing Ukraine's the counteroffensive, and he said, if that progress continues, and likely it will, Putin could be tempted to use a tactical nuclear weapon, or just as likely, try to destroy the nuclear power plant. Both actions have dire consequences for the health of Ukraine, but also surrounding NATO nations. Poland is at immediate risk if the use of tactical nuclear weapons or destruction of a nuclear power plant causes radiation to spread, as almost certainly it would, causing significant human harm. He went on, this is not a reckless or panicky resolution. It's based on fact and science, and it is meant to send a message to Vladimir Putin and even more directly to his military. They will be destroyed. They will be eviscerated if they use tactical nuclear weapons, if they destroy a nuclear plant in a way that threatens surrounding NATO nations. Here's the important bit. Article 5 is there for a reason. It doesn't protect only against a specific soldier crossing a boundary, but harm to our NATO allies triggers our obligation when it comes from a hostile force, as would happen if there were radiation that spread, causing significant harm to human life. This message ought to be taken seriously by Vladimir Putin and his generals. His military risks total obliteration by NATO forces if they are so reckless and irrational and has to resort to tactical nuclear weapons. So that was Senator Blumenthal there. You'll find all this online. You'll see the press conference. I mean, they're very blunt. Obviously, they're not in Biden's administration, but they are very, very senior members of the Senate. And if they're able to achieve the bipartisan support for this draft resolution, as they have for others, and they've pushed through one already that had 100% support from the whole Senate. So that sends a very, very clear signal to the White House as to where the Senate is, where the view is. And so, as I say, even though they're not part directly of Biden's administration, I mean, he's then able to. Well, he then firstly takes a very strong political message from the Senate, but also it gives him confidence that he can then take messages through his diplomatic channels, knowing he's got the support of the Senate. So that draft resolution is still draft, obviously, until it's voted on. But we should keep an eye on that, because that language there, well, there's no room for second guessing, and they're saying it's not the action in and of itself, blasting a tactical nuclear weapon, but the resultant threat to NATO members could trigger Article 5. So I think we do need to take these people. They are very seasoned senators, so we need to listen to what they're saying and chart with very great interest the course of this draft resolution.
Dom, any more updates from you?
Well, no more updates really, but I'd be keen to pick your brains now that you've made it back and hopefully done all your washing.
Absolutely, please. I'm all ears.
Well, I guess straight off the bat, we are, as we say repeatedly on the pod, access to first-hand information is very, very difficult because of the reporting restrictions in the country. So you were there and travelling around. If you're able to say where you went, terrific. But more broadly, do you think that there's anything we are fundamentally missing over here? We are looking through a very foggy lens at this, but have we got any fundamental things wrong? Are there certain aspects of this war that we're just completely oblivious to, that you've managed to see because you're out there?
I mean, I wouldn't necessarily say that I think we get fundamental things wrong, but I think for us to bear in mind is just the sheer scale and size. I mean, the front is more than 1,000 miles long. I was sort of close by for one day, going with these British volunteers to deliver aid and help to some soldiers who'd come out of the front line to pick it up. That was in Donbass. And, that gave me an insight a little bit into the soldiers, into, their demeanour, what they said. I talked to quite a few of them. And that's just one tiny snapshot of everything going on. That's what really brought it home to me, that with our updates and with the information that we do get either from Russian sources or Ukrainian sources, it's such a vast canvas to try and draw conclusions on. And actually, having that experience with those people in these places is I think hugely valuable to add to our reporting on it. But that's one of the really big things I took away, I think, was just how big this is and actually how difficult it is to really get a good sense of what's going on. I mean, Roland's talked before about the fog of war. and the difficulty of getting reliable information, the temptation to dramatise and believe anything you see on social media. And it's actually really, really quite difficult when you're there because, of course, at any moment, the air alert can go off and you'll have to seek cover or think about what you're doing. And coming onto the pod when I was calling in when I was out there, I'll admit, you guys probably had a much better sense of what was going on, broadly speaking, than I did, because there just isn't time to try and read every update and understand what's going on. So yeah, that would be my really big takeaway, I think, that I don't think we get things wrong, but I think we're doing very broad brushstroke things, and there's all sorts of stories and all sorts of things happening, I think, that are not being reported on purely because it's very difficult to source, very difficult to get people to go on the record, and it's just an absolutely huge battlefront. There are hundreds of thousands of people fighting, and it's very, very difficult, I think, for any journalists to be able to get the full picture, and actually going in and just trying to tell, that's what I think we try and do it, right, is we try and do the broad stories as we see it, but also focus in and talk to the people on the ground whose lives are being impacted, be they civilians or soldiers. So that the sort of fog of war, the vast scale of the war, that's what this trip really brought home to me, I think.
Sure. And what about the patchwork of volunteer organisations? We speak to many on this pod, obviously, and those were the guys, some of the guys you were heading out there with. But I mean, is there like a traffic jam from Lviv to Kyiv of external volunteer groups, all shoving 4x4s in there and what have you? And what's the feeling amongst the people who you're passing this aid on to? Have they had some poor experiences with international groups, someone who's maybe not out there for the Ukrainian cause but trying to make a buck? Is there any sort of corruption starting to creep into that sector?
I mean, there's quite a few things to say here. I think first off the bat, it's important to say that I was with British volunteers, and actually in country, of course, there are hundreds of thousands, millions of Ukrainian volunteers who sometimes work with external organisations and external contacts, but more often than not are working within country to supply units either associated with their hometowns, where they're from, or their friends and family. There's an absolutely huge network of Ukrainian volunteers doing exactly the same work as well. We shouldn't necessarily think it's just all external people coming in and handing over. I mean, that's what I saw when I was down with these British volunteers, is they couldn't have done what they did without working with Ukrainians and for translation, for finding out what was needed and where. So when we're thinking about volunteers who are aiding the Ukrainian army, aiding Ukrainian civilians, it's important to bear in mind that it's mainly Ukrainians doing this. I mean, of course it is. In terms of is there a traffic jam from Lviv to Kyiv? You certainly see a few people out there. You see people from different places on the road sometimes. I wouldn't say it's loads, but then again, I would go back to the point that it's an absolutely vast country. There are all sorts of different crossing places, so it's very difficult to get a sense, and I don't think many people are actually counting of actually how many groups are doing this sort of thing. I think broadly speaking, the volunteers had a very humbling experience. I mean, it's the difference between, listening to a podcast or reading the news or reading interviews with people impacted by the war, deciding to help, and then seeing for yourself what your aid and what the material they'd bought and transported means to people is quite something. I mean, I interviewed one volunteer and two soldiers, and the soldier, the commanding officer of the one of the units that was receiving the aid, cried when I asked her sort of what it meant to her that people had been travelling 1,500 miles, carrying all this stuff and carrying all this aid for her troops. What did it mean to her to know that? And she welled up. So seeing the impact of what these people are doing from the beginning, driving from London all the way to Donbass, I think was quite interesting. In terms of are people there for the right reasons? I think there's a whole kaleidoscope of people I've met and talked to, and there's never just one reason, I think, why people go to, I remember what Joe Barnes said, I think months and months ago, that, it does take somebody a little bit special to want to go to a war zone. It's a very difficult one without sort of doing more interviews, but people are a mix of drives and motivations. People want to help. People sometimes, my impression is, maybe running away from something in their own lives back home. People, want adventure. They want excitement, and certainly going to a place like this and helping gives you that. I think another thing to bear in mind, of course, is that when all these volunteers from all different places came over, they had no idea how long they'd be staying, and I'd be very interested to find out actually how many of them are managing to support themselves. I've heard sort of whispers in this and talk of this, that actually, we're a year and a half in, and lots of people are talking about, they're using their savings to do this, or they're using the money they earned from a previous job, which they now do not have, to do this. So there's going to be an interesting question, I'm sure it's already being asked, of just how long quite a few of these people can still do this.
One thing that you brought to us last week, but I'd be really interested to hear your reflections in the how it was received in Ukraine, was this reaction when Mayor Klitschko, after some of his officials, and correct me here because I'm probably misremembering, but some of his officials were seen and sort of snapped by the paparazzi in a bar after the 10 p.m. curfew. And he had a massive clampdown and said, right, I fired them, I think, didn't you tell us? And I just wonder what happened in the next few days. Did that send a shockwave through the late night bar scene in Ukraine? Did it really result in a clampdown?
Yeah, I mean, so this came from Friday night. Well, attempted dinner and drinks with my Ukrainian friend Anna, and that we managed to have dinner, but it was curtailed by the closure of the restaurant, and we couldn't find another place because of this sort of 10 p.m. police come around and say, right, we've had this scandal. You guys need to shut by 10, and if you're not, and we come around again, you may receive an invitation to join the armed forces. I mean, yeah, you could see it. We had to eat earlier and just keep an eye on the time, really, because people were following it. And this is just, of course, in certain districts in Kyiv, so it's very difficult to say where else this was clamped down on. I mean, the thing I really took away from that was the people are really pissed off that they're following the rules, and certain officials, the story came from Ukrainska Pravda, are bending them, staying out, not paying any attention to curfew, that kind of thing. And I think people also feel that that they're trying to live as normally as possible, enjoy life, go to bars, see their friends, and the fact that suddenly there's another layer of restrictions that they can't do through no fault of their own is utterly, it's so, people are so angry, and I think rightly so angry about that. I didn't get a sense of how long that's going to continue, actually. That'll be very interesting to hear from Ukrainian friends and contacts if this is still going on in a week or that kind of thing.
Yeah, sure. We should keep in touch with that. And just finally, so it was about a year ago that you and I were trundling around out there. Any reflections on another year gone by, another summer at war?
I think from what I saw, people have had to just adapt to what's happening, and everybody you see, and everywhere you go, and everyone you talk to has had to sort of integrate the invasion into their lives. From the obvious sort of, what do you do if there's an air alarm, to, how can you support your friends and family, to questions about their own future. Are they going to stay in Ukraine? Is it too dangerous? Some people that we've spoken to over the past year, remember, have moved twice. They left parts of the Donbass in 2014, 2015, moved somewhere safer, maybe to Bucha, maybe to Kyiv, and have moved again. And I think that's almost, in some ways, the most impressive thing, that people carry on, they're resolute, they're determined to see this through, and they're able to sort of take care of themselves, support their friends, support their family, all while at any moment, at any day, the air alarm can go off, and you don't necessarily know what's heading towards you, and whether it's going to land next to you or whether it's going to land several miles down the road. And also the flip side of that is just how awful and depressing that is, that kind of trauma, that kind of stress has continued unabated, and nobody knows when it'll end. So as I said, in a way, it's sort of incredibly impressive, I think, what Ukrainians have managed. But on the other hand, you wish it had never happened to them.
Yeah, very interesting. Well, I mean, as we report the news and you see them through the lens of your recent experience, you'd be really keen to keep going back to that and see what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I mean, even earlier when you were doing your updates and talking through some of these towns, their names and so on, Kharkiv, something, and suddenly I realised, I've seen it. I know what Kharkiv looks like. The centre of the town, there's not a single building that is undamaged. There's so many boarded up shops. There's so many boarded up windows. And to see it for yourself, there's a sort of a jolt of recognition when you said the name of, I actually have a sort of, personal memories now of that place. It's not just a place you see on the news. Well, Dom Nichols, did you have a final thought?
I did an interview this morning, pre-recorded interview with Alice Edwards. She's the UN, try fitting this on a business card, the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman and Degrading Treatment or Punishment, abbreviated to the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture. So we mentioned this Wednesday, Tuesday? I saw the press release come out. Now, I incorrectly called it a report about her investigation into alleged Russian torture, systemic use of torture. Now, it turns out it's not actually a report. I asked if I could see the report, and she said, well, no, it doesn't actually exist. The document is what's called an allegation letter. So she has got all these allegations. She's put her analysis on it, and she's drawn together what evidence she can. She's written to the government of Russia and sent them this allegation letter outlining the reports that she's received and these allegations on widespread and systemic torture. And they now have 60 days to respond to it. So early August-ish, they should respond. They've signed up to the UN Convention on Torture. They're a P5 member, so, obviously expect them to do the right thing here. So they should reply by early August, at which point this document will come out and we will see exactly what these allegations are. But she told me in broad brushstrokes that the pattern of the torture that she was hearing about like who was singled out, what methods were employed, this implied a level of direction because it was just too specific. The same thing or the same mocked up torture devices used many, many different places, not the same sort of geographic area. It's not like one rogue unit. So she is alleged, certainly widespread, but she's alleged systemic torture directed from above. So I asked her about that. She couldn't speak too specifically about individual cases because these are allegations and there will hopefully be criminal charges brought at the end of it. But we spoke about her work, we spoke about her role, we spoke about the relationship with the International Criminal Court. And yes, I asked her whether or not she had received allegations of torture by Ukrainian forces. And yes, I asked her about how other P5 nations have what their sort of history has been in this area. And yes, I did ask her about the recent case of Ben Roberts-Smith in Australia. So it's about 25 minutes, pre-recorded interview. That's going to come out on Monday because Monday is the International Day in support of victims of torture. And we will definitely return to it. She and I are going to stay in touch. And then when undoubtedly Russia give a fulsome and very detailed response, early August, we the public will be able to see this allegation letter and see quite what has been said. But yeah, that's coming out on Monday.
And now an interview from Francis with one of our own colleagues here at the Telegraph, Con Coughlin.
Earlier this week, I interviewed our defence editor, Con Coughlin, well known for his extensive coverage of international affairs over many decades for The Telegraph, particularly in the Middle East. He has just published a biography of Bashar al-Assad, the dictator of Syria. In our conversation, we discuss the impact of the Syrian Civil War on the conflict in Ukraine and the mistakes the West has made in recent decades in handling the shifting geopolitical plates around the world. This is our conversation. Well, Con, thank you very much for your time. You've had a highly distinguished career in journalism, to put it mildly, not only for The Telegraph, but for many other publications, including in the United States. Can you briefly outline your background and experience for listeners who may not be familiar with your work?
Well, good to be with you, Francis. Yes, well, I've been a journalist now for more than 40 years, and most of my career has been working for The Telegraph Group. I joined in 1980 after my training. At university, I always wanted to get into journalism, and in particular, I wanted to be a foreign correspondent. I wanted to be covering what people call the first draft of history. So very quickly, I was in the Middle East covering the civil war in Lebanon in the early 80s. And talking about the book, you know, my interest in this region goes back to that time when, you know, Syria was working with Russia to attack the Americans in Lebanon, etc. Then I went on to open the Telegraph's first Jerusalem bureau in 1986. I covered the first Gulf War, and I've covered many conflicts since, the Balkans, etc. And yes, I have also worked for other media. I've written for the Wall Street Journal. I've worked for CNN and MSNBC and Fox News and NBC, based as a commentator on all these various issues. And it's something I love doing. I've been doing it all my career and want to carry on doing it.
Wonderful. Well, thanks for that, Con. Now, this week, as you say, you published a biography on Bashar al-Assad, the dictator of Syria. It's called Assad, the Triumph of Tyranny. The war in Ukraine has led to a renewed focus on that war, I think it's fair to say, especially given the Russian involvement there and on the red lines crossed regarding chemical warfare. Indeed, General David Petraeus writes of your book that it's a superb analysis of the West's policy missteps and the tragic consequences of them. In the context of Ukraine, first of all, what lessons do you think Syria offers us?
Well, I think the fundamental issue is Syria shows what happens when the West turns its back on a major conflict. And I think all of your listeners will be aware of what happened in the House of Commons in 2013. when the Commons voted against a proposition put forward by the Cameron government to take military action against Bashar al-Assad's regime in Damascus after it used chemical weapons against its own people. And that was after President Obama, who was then in power in Washington, had set a red line that if the Assad regime did use chemical weapons against its own people, there would be a military response. That vote in the House of Commons, which I blame a lot on Ed Miliband, who steadied back the military action and then withdrew his support.
Leader of the opposition at the time, yes.
The Labour opposition leader, yeah. And that was a terrible blow. And of course, it gave Obama, who felt it wasn't really his responsibility to hold Assad account, the justification he needed not to follow through on his promise. And so the consequence of that was that the Assad regime survived intact, and subsequently both Iran and Russia became involved militarily on Assad's behalf and won the war, but at a terrible cost for the Syrian people. The latest humanitarian assessment is 500,000 Syrians perished during the conquest. And it's important to set that out, Francis, because, you know, when you look at Ukraine, where the West is a lot more involved, you see, I mean, a lot of people question just how much the West, NATO, etc., should be acting in support of the Ukrainians. And of course, when you look at what happened to Syria, where we didn't provide military support or any form of intervention, you see what happened. So I think that the moral of the Syrian conflict is, you know, if you don't get involved, then terrible things happen. And this is why, you know, I remain a very firm supporter of the NATO support for Ukraine in its war against Russia.
Well, thanks, Con. Just staying on this subject for a moment and the implications of the war on Ukraine, can you just talk a little bit more on the Russian involvement? And I know that some of the generals, of course, as we've spoken about on the podcast in the past, that were in Syria are now in Ukraine. I'd be interested to hear your reflections on that.
Yes, well, probably a third of the book looks in some detail at exactly what the Russians did in Syria. And I think in general terms, most people will recall the terrible devastation the Russians inflicted on rebel strongholds like Aleppo, which were leveled to the ground. And the tactics used against Aleppo were very similar to the tactics the Russians had used earlier in their assault against Grozny during the Chechen conflict, where they basically ignored all the normal laws of warfare and just pummeled civilian areas into submission. We haven't seen anything like this since the Second World War in Europe, and it's quite appalling. But, and I think this is where the Russian experience in Ukraine is very interesting. In Syria, the Russians didn't encounter any meaningful opposition. The rebel groups were militias. They didn't have the ability to defend their skies against Russian air power and Russian missiles. And so the Syrian rebels were completely outgunned and crushed. And a lot of the Russian generals who fought in Syria, as you said, then went on to take part in the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where they thought the tactics they used in Syria would achieve the same results. But of course, the big difference is that in Ukraine, they met a properly organized and equipped military that completely defeated them. So one of the more important conclusions I reach in the book is that the Russians learnt all the wrong lessons from their involvement in Syria. And while their success in Syria in keeping the Bashar al-Assad regime in power encouraged Putin to launch his invasion of Ukraine last year, the military was in no fit state to carry out the kind of sophisticated military mission that was required to achieve any of its objectives in Ukraine.
It's very interesting. And how do you approach writing on a subject as murky as this? What are your main sources?
Well, it's been quite a challenge, actually, Francis, not least because I've been banned from going to Syria since 1985, when I was based in Beirut for the Daily Telegraph, and I went to Damascus to write about the Hafez al-Assad, the founder of the modern Ba'athist regime. And I upset the Baathists with the coverage I wrote for the Telegraph, and they told me I was not wanted. And subsequently, the critical coverage that I've written for the Telegraph on Syria and its main ally, Iran, and also the activities of Hezbollah in Lebanon, have made it very difficult for me. But, you know, journalists love a challenge, and I have spent more than 30 years covering and writing about the Middle East, so I have quite a broad network of contacts, both people in Syria and surrounding governments. So first of all, there are a lot of Syrians who fled the Syrian regime after the civil war started, people who were friends of Bashar al-Assad, people who holidayed with him, who have just been horrified at the way he's turned out to be one of the most barbaric dictators of the modern age. So that was a source. I mean, a lot of these people can't be named for obvious reasons. It is a very violent and vicious regime, and they track down a lot of their political enemies and kill them, as I detail in the book. Then there are lots of diplomats and intelligence services who've closely monitored the whole conflict, military personnel. For example, one of the generals I interview at length is General Rupert Jones, who was the second in command of the US coalition operation against Daesh, Islamic State, which was operating in Syria. And of course, General David Petraeus is an old friend really from Iraq days, and he was very helpful, as were a number of other military people. So add to that people from the Foreign Office, former British ambassadors, former American ambassadors to Damascus and the region. And, you know, if you just apply yourself, you very quickly develop a network of knowledge and research material that enables you to provide a pretty accurate story of what went on.
Absolutely, and we find the same on this podcast in relation to Ukraine. Staying on Assad, he's of course recently, within I think the last fortnight or so, been accepted back into the fold by Arab nations after years out in the cold. Why now, and how significant do you think that is?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I must say on a personal level, I'm absolutely appalled about the rehabilitation of the Assad regime, especially by the Arab states. But also you see this elsewhere, that the other countries are starting to take more of an interest in Bashar al-Assad. I mean, the first thing I would say is that Bashar al-Assad and his British-born wife, Asma, it seems they live in a parallel universe where they were the victims in the civil war. Their narrative, which their supporters still try to get out, is that they were the victims of a cruel, barbaric Islamic State attempt to remove their regime and establish the caliphate in Damascus. Well, this is nonsense. I mean, the roots of the civil war were ordinary Syrians, not of an Islamist persuasion, who were sick and tired of the brutality and repression they suffered at the hands of the Ba'ath Party and wanted change as part of that movement in 2011 known as the Arab Spring. So I find it very upsetting on a personal level that the Arabs are moving to rehabilitate the Assad regime. But this is real politics writ large. Probably the most important dynamic in the Middle East region today is the encroachment of China into the region, an area that in the decades I've been working there was almost negligible. And the reason for this, the reason that China is moving into the Middle East, is the growing despair in Riyadh and other capitals that formerly regard themselves as allies of the US at the Biden administration. And they responded by forging closer links with Beijing. And Beijing has helped to secure some kind of a diplomatic rapprochement between Tehran in Iran and Saudi Arabia. Now, Tehran is a very close ally of Syria. And so now that China has helped to establish this diplomatic rapprochement, it follows that the Arab states should also try and repair relations with Damascus, with the result that Syria was recently invited to take part in an Arab League summit, from which it had been excluded for nearly a decade. So those are the sort of geopolitical, realpolitik reasons behind what is going on. But I think it's a very dangerous trend, particularly as it's taking place against a background where Iran is still working very hard on its nuclear program, which most intelligence services I deal with believe is ultimately geared to developing nuclear weapons.
Well, that was actually going to be my next question, Con, which is, you were just talking there about the state of the Middle East at the moment. There has been a lot of discussion in our paper and many others about the dangers of escalation between Iran and Israel. How serious do you think those escalations are? Are we looking at some kind of conflict in the Middle East in the short to long term?
Well, the whole proposition that there will be a conflict between Iran and Israel, caused by Iran's pursuit of its nuclear program, has been going on for about 2 decades. I've lost count of the number of times, I've written articles examining the likelihood of Israel and Iran going to war, and it hasn't happened yet. I think there's a lot of bluster on both sides, and of course a war between Iran and Israel, given that Israel does have a nuclear arsenal, could be quite catastrophic for the region. But undoubtedly the Israelis are alarmed at the progress Iran has been making recently on developing enriched uranium stockpiles it requires to build nuclear warheads. But the Israelis have also become a lot more subtle in disrupting the Iranian program. You'll remember that several very prominent Iranian nuclear scientists were killed in mysterious circumstances. There was a very successful cyber attack on the Natanz facility where a lot of the enrichment work goes on, and so forth. So Israel is very adept at finding new ways to disrupt Iran without resorting to a conventional military attack. But that is not to say it could not happen, particularly as Iran, despite all these diplomatic overtures that I was talking about earlier, remains intent on expanding its military presence around the Middle East, particularly in Syria and Lebanon, where it's built up enormous stockpiles of missiles, which are aimed directly at Israeli towns and cities. And this is not a tenable position for the Israelis. And we've seen in recent months the Israeli Air Force conducting airstrikes inside Syria, inside Lebanon, to disrupt Iran's activities. So it is a very volatile situation. But I think both sides, both Tehran and Jerusalem, understand how high the stakes are. And while there is a lot of rhetoric, a lot of bellicose rhetoric, neither side actually want to take that step that would provoke a direct military confrontation.
That's very interesting. Now, you write in the book, just changing subject slightly, that you think it's tragically unlikely that Assad will ever face justice for a war that, as you say, has seen about 500,000 killed. We've obviously seen an arrest warrant issued for Putin due to war crimes in Ukraine. Do you think it will be the same for Putin and his acolytes, or do you think that there is a way he will one day stand trial?
Well, it should be, Francis, is all I can say. I mean, if the international community can summon the support to charge Vladimir Putin with war crimes over his conduct in Ukraine, then it should certainly do the same with Bashar al-Assad in Syria. The problem is, for various geopolitical reasons, the West has always backed away from this kind of direct confrontation. A good example was at the turn of the century in 2005, when the then Lebanese Prime Minister, Rafik Hariri, was killed in a car bomb in Beirut. And all the evidence suggested that the assassination was carried out on the orders of Iran and Syria and carried out by Hezbollah. And there was a UN investigation that looked into this. And I've spoken to people who've seen the evidence, who worked on the whole case of the assassination of Hariri. And there is little doubt in their mind that the whole thing was planned by Bashar al-Assad and his brother Maher and carried out by Hezbollah. Yet when the final UN report came out, no mention of this was made. It was all redacted, and it was redacted because at the time, Europe and the US, particularly the Obama administration, wanted to get a nuclear deal with Tehran, and they didn't want to upset Tehran, and so none of this material was put in the final UN report. And something similar is happening now with Bashar al-Assad and all the terrible war crimes that he has committed. Now, I have a whole chapter in the book called War Criminal, where I set out in detail how Bashar al-Assad himself personally directed the brutalization of his people from day one of the uprising in March 2011. He set up a system of bureaucratic security structure to deal with the uprising in the most appalling terms. I mean, you're talking about mass rape, mass executions. I mean, it is absolutely appalling. And there are bodies. It's not just me. There are bodies outside, particularly dissident groups, who spent the last decade collecting incontrovertible evidence of these war crimes, which at the very least needs to be put before a war crimes tribunal to judge the exact complicity of Bashar al-Assad in this. At the moment, nothing is happening, and I find that very dispiriting. But yeah, the world can change. Back in the 1990s, I was in Sarajevo for the Telegraph, covering the terrible Bosnian Civil War, where again terrible atrocities were committed by both sides, by both the Croatians and the Serbians. And at the time, nobody thought they'd ever see justice. And yet, decades later, the perpetrators ended up at the Hague and went to prison and were convicted because the whole political landscape changed, and that allowed the convictions to proceed. And I fervently hope, particularly if Putin loses the war in Ukraine and is removed from power, that something similar will happen with Bashar al-Assad.
Interesting. And do you think that Putin himself will one day be in a dock?
It all depends on the outcome of the war. I mean, a lot of the people I've spoken to, and I'm sure your other contributors are talking to similar people, there is a degree of confidence that the Ukrainian military has the organization and equipment to destroy the Russian forces in Ukraine. And if that happens, the implications for Putin and his cronies could be absolutely catastrophic. And it was the political changes in Serbia and Croatia that allowed those responsible for carrying out war crimes during the Bosnian conflict to end up on trial in The Hague. It is not beyond the bounds of possibility that Vladimir Putin could find himself sent off to the ICC to stand trial if the political landscape changes in a certain direction and he loses in Ukraine.
Changing tack slightly, like me, you trained as a historian. I believe your tutelage was under famous author Simon Sharma.
That's right.
Perhaps that's for another time. But when you look over the decades of your career, what are the biggest mistakes that you think the West has made?
Oh, that's a big question, Francis. I mean, as I said, I've been writing about these issues for 40 years now. I think the first thing I'd say is that after the collapse of the Iron Curtain and the collapse of the Soviet Union in the late 80s, early 90s, a degree of complacency settled on the world, the whole end of history argument, which of course was quickly overturned when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. But in general terms, there was a disarmament, that took place, and an unwillingness to believe that state-on-state conflict would ever appear again. I think that was really a big mistake. And of course, I think when one looks back to the September 11 attacks in 2001, which are sort of defined the first quarter of the 21st century, certainly I think we all overreacted to the scale of the threat posed by Al-Qaeda and other Islamist groups. There was a threat, and we dealt with it very effectively when we first moved into Afghanistan in late 2001. And I still believe that getting rid of Saddam Hussein was a good thing, because I covered the first Gulf War and he never complied with his ceasefire obligations and he was a menace. But the post-Saddam administration of Iraq, Abu Ghraib and all that, has caused enormous problems, as has the rather messy involvement in Afghanistan, to the extent now that Western leaders, and we referred to this at the start of our conversation, sometimes lack the political will to tackle head-on major global security challenges. And it is actually quite rewarding to see the level of support Ukraine has received in resisting Russian aggression. But as we've seen, Francis, there have also been divisions within the Western alliance, with some people wanting to do a deal with Putin, others wanting a more robust approach. So it's stepping stones. We're still learning from our mistakes. And then, of course, you look at the terrible state of the British Armed Forces at the moment, with an army that's hardly fit to deploy anywhere, a navy that's where most of its ships spend most of the year at port and not at sea, and a very limited RAF. So there's still a lot of ground to be made up.
Staying on this subject of political will, Con, as you say, there is division within the alliance, and the longer this war goes on, some people predict that commitment may dissipate somewhat. Do you feel, in all your years of experience, that the Western resolve is there for a total Ukrainian victory as they see it?
It is in some quarters, and I think the big issue is how committed Washington is. I think you've seen with the London Reconstruction Conference this week on Ukraine that there is still a desire to help Ukraine, but a lot of countries are still wary of allowing Ukraine to join NATO and the European Union. And we can see from the politics in Washington, a lot of people on both sides of the political divide are uncomfortable with the level of American support for Ukraine. And so I don't think it's guaranteed. I mean, I think my hope is that the Ukrainians will force the West to support them through their resolve and their success in the battlefield. It's sad that it has to be that way, but I think that's where we are. But I'm also confident that the Ukrainians can prevail.
Well, Con, thank you very much. As ever, it's a pleasure to talk to you about these matters. You sit a couple of chairs down from me and we often talk about these things. So it's a real pleasure to be able to bring that kind of conversation to our listeners on the podcast. Is there anything else that we haven't discussed today that you'd just like to draw attention to for those listening around the world?
I think we haven't spoken a great deal about China. I mean, I've talked about China within the context of the Middle East. But, I think we need to be aware of China wherever we look in the world. And I mentioned the Reconstruction Conference on Ukraine in London, where, lots of money has been pledged, but the caveats are also suggest that the money may never be forthcoming. And waiting in the wings will be Beijing, that would love nothing more than to move into Ukraine and establish a foothold on Europe's doorstep. So I think we need to be very vigilant about what the Chinese are up to. And as we saw during US Secretary of State Antony Blinken's recent visit to Beijing, the Chinese are in no mood to reach any kind of meaningful accommodation with the US or any other Western power. They want the opposite. So I think my final word of warning is beware what is going on in Beijing.
Well, Con Coughlin, thank you very, very much for your time. For those listening who want to buy Con's book, we'll make sure we put a link in the description to it. And as ever, you're writing for the Telegraph every week, so I would also point listeners to your columns as well. So, Con, thank you very much.
My pleasure, Francis.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest, or sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings you stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload, so if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do refer to podcast apps. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app, and, if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message, and you can contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our Twitter handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Elliot Lampitt, and the executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.